Hello, and today on the Wine School we're going to be having a little overview of Hungary and Austria, two countries that used to be one as part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. There's a few similarities between their wines, but there's actually far more differences. Hungary's got a very long tradition of winemaking, and it had a hugely fantastic reputation right up until the end of the 19th century. Two world wars and communism really put paid to that. Under Soviet rule, the emphasis was on quantity, not quality. It was all about the yields. So a lot of the traditions and all the sort of winemaking history was almost lost. Thankfully, with the introduction of sort of more modern winemaking practices and new investment coming into the country, as well as people remembering the old ways of doing things, and some of it having been preserved, we're now starting to see an emergence of a great modern winemaking tradition in Hungary. There are many wine regions. Most of the production is actually in the centre of the country, in the Hungarian basin, the Pannonian Plain. A lot of it is really jug wine, so we'll just focus briefly on the four main regions, which are Villani, Nagy, Somló, Eger, and most famously Tokai. In Villani, most of the producers have gone with imported French varieties, making Bordeaux blends and that kind of thing with some success. Some of them are really good wines. They also use a lot of Frankos, which is a native grape, which you also see in Germany and Austria as Blaufrankisch, as well as some Portuguesa, which is a light grape that makes some good but rarely great wine. Nagy Somló's signature grape is Jurfák, and that makes, perhaps more than any other Hungarian wine, a really rich, spicy white wine. In fact, that's a hallmark of most Hungarian wines, that they're quite powerful, quite rich. It goes really well with the native cuisine, a lot of which is based on paprika, so you need really strong wines to stand up to these really strongly flavoured cuisines. Forget the delicate perfumed light Moselle Rieslings. These are really, really gutsy wines. That brings us on to Eger, which is the most famous wine outside of Hungary, aside from Tokai, is Egri Bikava, or Bull's Blood, which was quite popular in the UK at one point. It was one of their biggest exports, particularly during Soviet times, but some of it could be quite light, some of it really full-bodied, which is the way it's meant to be. It's supposed to be a blend of at least 3 grape varieties, of which Frankos has to be at least 50%, so naturally enough it makes that really rich Bull's Blood, dark red, spicy wine. Tokai, however, is unquestionably one of the great wines of the world, always has been. Even during Soviet times there was still enough small production of some of the top quality, most of which no doubt went to the Politburo rather than for export. The main grape here is Furmint, which, like Semillon, is thin-skinned and very susceptible to noble rot, and it makes, through this method, it makes really great sweet wines. Hársly Lévú, which is another white grape here, is less prone, but it also does contribute to the overall flavour of Tokai. The 27 villages of Tokai are in an area with a microclimate very suited to noble rot. Here it's called Azú. You'll see it on the label of the sweeter wines, Tokai Azú. With morning mist similar to those in Sauterne, encouraging the botrytis fungus to infect the ripened grapes and shrivel them to unsightly but deliciously sweet concentration. The wines can be made anything from really, really dry to extraordinarily sweet, everything in between. Samodny can be anything from dry to medium sweet, depending on the level of nobly rotted grapes that are in there. There's generally no selection, but with Azú levels of 3, 4, 5 or 6 Puttonyos, 6 being the sweetest, they are the properly, fully botrytized wines. The Puttonyos refers to the container in which the mashed Azú grapes are carried. The more containers of sweet grapes, the sweeter the wine. The difference here, unlike from Sauterne and Moselle, is that the grapes are actually added to a base wine made from unbotrytized grapes, and then there's a second, much slower fermentation with these sweet grapes, which I think gives Tokai its unique character. And this long, really slow fermentation can take several months. The rare and expensive Essencia is made from the free-run juice, so it's not added to a base wine, and this can ferment incredibly slowly given the amount of sugar in there. It can take years in some cases, and it can be beautiful, but often a producer may only make a few dozen, maximum a few hundred bottles of this, and it's naturally enough very expensive. Some traditionalists also age the Tokai in a barrel under a sherry-like floor, a bit like the wines of sherry. Now, not to go into too much detail about this, but the floor doesn't age the wines oxidatively. It actually matures them biologically, so it adds another layer of flavour and complexity to some of the top wines of Tokai that again can't be found in other sweet wines throughout the world. Given that good sweet Tokai is generally pretty expensive, I thought we'd try a dry example of the wine, because they're often overlooked in favour of the sweet wines, and they're great food wines, I think. And this example from Cardos, it's their Furmint. So it's made 100% from the main grape of the area. There's loads of character in there. It does actually smell almost like it could be sweet. But there's lots of lime blossom in there as well, a little bit of honey. Loads of acidity in there. It's a really taut wine. It could actually age for 3 or 4 more years and develop a little bit more of that honeyed complexity, but as it is at the moment, with that lovely lemon acidity, it'd be a great match for something like seafood, poultry, the traditional Hungarian chicken paprikash with that sort of paprika flavour again. Lovely wine. Austria, on the other hand, has many different styles of wines. The climate is quite different. It's slightly more mountainous. Most of the vineyards are in the east of the country. If you think of the west of Austria, it's mostly Alps, which is great for skiing, not so good for grapes. One thing to mention about Austria that may be in the back of people's minds is the scandal in the 1980s, where glycol was added by some unscrupulous producers, and this simply boosted the impression of body and sweetness in the wines. It's quite dangerous because it's poisonous, but it also ruined their reputation. It took them decades to get it back. The great thing is, though, that you really need to banish this from your mind, because Austria now has some of the most stringent wine laws in the world for quality and for analysing the safety and what is actually in the bottle. And the overall quality is just amazing from Austria these days. Austria's production is mostly white, and most of that is Grüne Veltliner. It's their signature indigenous grape. You do see a little bit of it from outside, and I'd like to see more of it grown in areas like New Zealand and South Africa. But from Austria, some of the examples are world-class and some really lovely food-friendly wines. They also make some great Pinot Blanc, here called Weißburgunder, that's the German name, as well as Welsh Riesling and the true Riesling, although we don't see as much of that in the UK as we do Grüne Veltliner. For reds, Blaufrankisch is really important, which we just saw in Hungary's Kak-Frankos. And Saint Laurent is another grape that you see a little bit. It has slightly higher acidity, flavours of damsons and cherries. Saint Laurent's often described as Pinot Noir on steroids, so a little bit fuller bodied. There's another grape called Zweigelt, which is actually a crossing of Blaufrankisch and Saint Laurent, and it has some of the best elements of both of its parents. So you get some of that little Pinot Noir fruitiness, but it's a little bit fuller bodied as well, with a little bit of sour cherry acidity. It's a little bit more tart, I think, than many Pinot Noirs could be. So Austria is split into 3 main areas. There's Niederösterreich, or Lower Austria, Burgenland and Steiermark. Steiermark makes some really good whites from Pinot Blanc, Weißburgunder, Sauvignon Blanc, Chardonnay, Müller-Thurgau. Some great examples of all of those. Burgenland encompasses the Neusiedler Lake, which is really unusual. It's very wide, but it's very shallow. It's only about 3 feet, 1 metre deep, which is very, very odd for an inland lake to be that shallow. What this does to the area is it acts as a natural heat sink, so it can extend the autumns a little bit in the surrounding area, so you get a slightly longer ripening period. But more importantly, for the vineyards closer to the lake, is you get those evening mists spreading out from this sort of big body of water, and naturally enough that encourages botrytis. So there's some great sweet wines from here. Riesling, naturally enough. Grüne Veltliner is quite resistant to botrytis, but I've also had a few really unusual examples of Baron Auslese or botrytized Chardonnay and even Pinot Noir. There's a few sort of weird and wonderful examples out there. With it being a more recently planted area, I think we're going to see a lot more of those coming through over the next 10-15 years as well. A lot of the plantings in Burgenland were the result of EU investment, so we're seeing a lot more non-native varieties planted here, but there's some great examples of Blaufrankisch. It does particularly well here because it's slightly warmer, and we'll come on to an example of that at the end. In Austria, Wachau is the area most associated with quality. It's very much seen as Austria's Moselle Valley. It's very similar. It has the steep slopes around the bends of the river, with the vineyards sort of planted in this sort of southerly facing aspects, the same as in the Moselle. It's a little bit warmer. The wines tend to be slightly fuller bodied, higher in alcohol, but you do get these cooling evening breezes that sort of cut through and retain the acidity, so the wines are really well balanced also. Generally, Grüne Veltliner favours the lower slopes. Riesling likes it a bit cooler, so it favours the slightly higher slopes, so it gets a little bit more sun, but it's slightly cooler, particularly at night. So it retains that all-important acidity. Although Wachau is really small, it produces just 3% of Austria's output. It has 900 distinctive areas, or Rieder, that it's divided into, and its wines are classified into three stages. There's the lightest, Steinfeder, Federspiel for those a little fuller body, and Smaragd for the fullest body with the highest levels of alcohol. So they're the sort of 3 levels of wines that you get from Wachau. Kremstal and Kamptal are perhaps less revered than Wachau, but the wines can be superb, and they're generally, I would argue, they can be on a par, and they're sometimes better value than the wines of Wachau. Kremstal is essentially an extension of Wachau, but the vineyards spread out a little more from the river. It's a little bit warmer, so the vineyards spread out onto the plain. The soil's a little bit rockier, a little bit more free draining. Kremstal is essentially an extension of the Wachau, but the vineyards spread out a little bit more away from the river. It's a little bit flatter, the land here. There's not quite the steep valley sides. Kamptal is similarly warmer than Wachau, but in some areas the vineyards are so steep that they're actually terraced. And what we have next is from Brundelmeier, Willy Brundelmeier, one of the best producers in the village of Langenlois, and it says Terrassen, it's grown on terraced vineyards, Grüne Veltliner. So trying their Grüne Veltliner next. It's lovely and light. One of the things that Grüne Veltliner is known for is it has an element of white pepper, and I think you get that really coming through on this. I mean, partly it's to do with the free draining soils that gives it that lovely minerality. But there's a lovely freshness to this wine. It could develop really well also. You'd get a little bit more of the earthy notes, a little bit more honey coming through if you gave it a few more years, but I think it's just beautiful right now. It's a few years old. It's that lovely slaty minerality, a little bit of salinity coming through as well. It's almost that sort of salty tang to it, a bit like the seaside. Great with seafood. It's a perfect seafood wine because of that. I think this could cut through anything, even fish and chips. I think it would be a fantastic match for. Great with poultry too, all those kind of things. Could work really well with Korean cuisine. It's a massively, massively versatile wine. For me, one of the more interesting things in the Austrian wine scene recently is Vienna is quite unique as a capital city in that it's almost semi-rural on the outskirts. There's vineyards almost to the sort of city suburbs. And these vineyards make a lot of the wines that's served in the local inns, the Heurigen, these lovely traditional inns of Vienna. And it used to be just basic jug wine that would go with whatever meal you were having, your Wiener Schnitzel, that kind of thing. But there's been more and more of a development, and they've become almost boutique wines. And then now called gemischter Satz. It means it's got to be a mixture, gemischt, of at least 3 different grape varieties. No oak contact, so they're lovely and light and fresh, but some of them are now actually becoming some of the best wines that Austria produces. And again, fantastic food wines. And we're just starting to see a few examples of those sort of come in to the UK now, and they're well worth trying, I think. Lastly then to the red wine, we're having a Blaufrankisch from Burgenland, and I wanted to do this last because it's the red, but also it ties us back into Hungary because this is a real area of crossover. The Blaufrankisch Keck-Frankos is the one grape that you find across both countries, and it does really well in both. And a bit like the Grüne Veltliner, I'd like to see it's more widely planted across other parts of the world because I think it's another great wine. So it's got a lovely fragrance, very fresh, but lots of damson in there, sort of hedgerow fruit. Lots of acidity in there, and I know I keep going on about acidity in all of these talks, but that lovely sour cherry in there, it's just such a lovely, refreshing, vibrant wine. It really is alive. It's not a sort of dark brooding Shiraz monster. It's not light and perfumed like Pinot Noir. It's very much its own thing. It's of its place. I think it's a great wine for the price. Really exciting, loads of complexity, loads of length, and I just think it's just such a fantastic little wine and a great place to sort of jump off away from Austria and Hungary. And next time we'll be coming home back to the UK and looking at the vineyards of England and Wales. So I look forward to seeing you then. Thank you.